beneath the wide desert sky, where stars burned like scattered embers and the silence carried a weight heavy enough to bend the soul, a single fire flickered against the endless dark. Its glow stretched long shadows across the sand, dancing shapes that seemed alive, whispering ancient secrets that only the lonely could hear. And there he was, Clyde Baxter, a man carved by dust, loss, and the cruel hand of fate, staring into those flames as if they held the answers to everything he'd buried inside. His chest ached with the memory of a ranch swallowed in fire, the smell of kerosene lingering in his dreams, the silence of everything he once called home. It was the kind of wound no doctor could heal, a hollowness where love, family, and belonging had once lived. Yet, that night, fate moved quietly, reshaping the silence with a presence that shouldn't have been there. Across the flames, kneeling with her torn habit and rosary beads spilling like broken constellations onto the sand, sat a woman who should not have survived these barren miles. Her eyes lifted, catching the firelight, shimmering with secrets that stirred something dangerous in him. Something between fear and a pull so magnetic it made his breath falter. She claimed to be a sister of mercy, yet her lips carried no thirst. Her skin bore no sun's cruelty, and her hands were too soft for the desert's brutality. He told himself to look away, to treat her as a stranger, an illusion the desert conjured to torment him. But her gaze, steady and unflinching, tethered him where he sat. That first moment was not one of peace, but of quiet tension, a slow storm gathering inside him. For every lie he suspected, every inconsistency he noticed in her words, there was a tenderness in the curve of her smile, a softness in her voice that made his hardened heart ache with something like longing. And within that ache there was healing, a fragile reminder that even in the bleakest stretches of life, something unexpected could still bloom. He wanted to believe, just for a heartbeat, that perhaps she had been sent to remind him he was not yet finished with this world. She knew his name before he had spoken it. The sound of Mr. Baxter rolling from her lips was enough to freeze his blood, yet the warmth of her tone thawed it in the same instant. Who was she? A savior disguised as a sinner, or a sinner cloaked in the illusion of salvation? He didn't know, and the not knowing was its own intoxicating poison. Every word she uttered seemed chosen to draw him deeper into her gravity, every gesture a promise that there was more behind the veil of her identity. And as the firelight kissed her face, he realized he could not turn away. The desert night wrapped around them like a shroud, yet for the first time in weeks, Clyde felt more than grief. He felt alive, even if what stirred inside him was laced with danger. His father's dream lay in ashes, his future scattered like dust in the wind, but in that fragile moment, facing a woman who smelled of jasmine when she should have reeked of survival, he felt a spark, not of vengeance alone, but of desire, of curiosity, of something that promised to heal and unravel him in equal measure. And to you listening, feeling the rhythm of this tale seep into your own heart, let this opening remind you of something profound, that sometimes in the most desolate corners of life, when everything seems burned away, love walks in uninvited, cloaked in mystery, carrying both danger and deliverance. If these words stir something within you, let your heart whisper it back, through a like, through a comment, through the gift of subscribing, because stories like these live on, not only in the telling, but in the shared breath of those who choose to feel them. The fire crackled louder, the desert winds carried secrets only they could hear, and Clyde Baxter leaned forward without realizing it, his fate colliding with hers beneath the starlit sky. The night was no longer empty. It was the beginning of everything he thought he had lost, the dangerous rebirth of longing itself, pulling him into a story that would change them both forever. And so, as the flames danced higher, the silence gave way to something neither fear nor desire could contain, leading them toward a destiny that would demand every ounce of their hearts. And from that first gaze across the fire, their journey began. The flames burned low, softening into glowing embers, and in their dim light the world seemed smaller, quieter, like the desert itself had chosen to hold its breath and listen. Clyde Baxter sat motionless, his hand hovering over the leather of his saddlebag, where the strange letter pressed against his ribs like a second heart. A letter he had never written, addressed to a woman who should not exist, bearing secrets no stranger should know. Across from him, the woman's rosary glimmered faintly as her slender fingers traced the beads backward, the wrong direction, as though prayers themselves bent in her hands. He watched her closely, trying to decide if she was a gift or a curse, salvation wrapped in silk, or ruin in disguise. She lifted her eyes, and for a moment it was as if the stars themselves had taken refuge there. There was no fear in her, not the kind most travelers carried when crossing this endless wasteland. Instead, there was a certainty, a calm strength that felt both healing and terrifying at once. "The desert reveals truths people try to bury," she murmured, her voice low and rich, vibrating against the stillness. "Out here, nothing can remain hidden." The words clung to him, threading through the ache of his losses, and though a part of him wanted to accuse her of deceit, another part longed to let those words stitch themselves into the torn fabric of his soul. Her scent drifted across the fire, jasmine, delicate, soothing, an impossible comfort in a place of dust and ash. He leaned back slightly, his chest tightening with the awareness of her closeness, of the strange warmth that rose between them. A man broken by fire and grief should not feel desire this sharp, this sudden, and yet it flared inside him with the same intensity that once drove him to build a life from the unforgiving soil. He tried to push it away, reminding himself of the evidence, of the names he had been hunting for weeks, of the vengeance burning in his veins. But the desert has a way of silencing vengeance, softening rage into something rawer, something more dangerous. Need. Her hand moved, and from within the folds of her habit she withdrew a small piece of charred wood. Clyde's breath caught, as the initials carved there caught the firelight, letters burned into his memory since childhood. The mark of his father's hand, once proudly placed on the beam of their ranch, now only a fragment carried by this woman. The sight hollowed him and filled him in the same heartbeat. Grief surged like a storm, but beneath it ran something else. The fragile thread of connection, the sense that she understood not only his loss, but the very shape of his pain. "Do you believe in divine justice?" she whispered, her voice brushing against his ear like a prayer meant to heal and to wound in equal measure. Clyde's fingers trembled as the relic slipped from his hand into the sand, as though it no longer belonged to him, but to the fate she carried. He wanted to demand answers, to force her to reveal how she had come into possession of something sacred, but her eyes, dark, shimmering with their own inner light, held him fast. There was no lie he could see there, only layers of truths too sharp to touch all at once. His voice came out rough, broken by weeks of sleepless nights. "You're no nun." The words were both accusation and confession, an acknowledgement of what his heart already knew. Her smile curved slowly, dangerously, and in its shadow there was beauty that could heal or destroy. "What gave me away? The jasmine, or the fact that I never asked you to pray?" Her tone carried both warmth and mockery, a reminder that she held power even in jest. And though he should have been furious, all he could think about was the way her lips shaped each word, how they gleamed in the glow of dying fire, how his body leaned unconsciously toward her like a flower to sunlight. The desert stretched silent around them, yet the space between their breaths grew louder, charged, heavy with something that reached deeper than either of them could admit aloud. She leaned forward, placing her hand lightly against his chest, and he felt the steady rhythm of his heart falter beneath her touch. The warmth of her palm bled through fabric and flesh until it reached the most wounded part of him, the place still scorched by loss. And somehow her touch felt like healing, like a balm pressed against a wound that would never fully close. "Your enemies are not shadows," she said softly, her words like threads weaving into his breaking edges. "They are men with names, with power, with blood on their hands. And I know them all." Each syllable landed like a match, igniting both fury and hope inside him. For weeks he had searched saloons, asked questions into the void, hunted ghosts that refused to show themselves. And here, in a single moment, this woman handed him the truth he had bled to find. Her words were too convenient, too dangerous, but he believed them. If not with his mind, then with something far deeper, something reckless. The fire had burned to embers now, but the heat between them grew brighter, more insistent, as if their bodies had chosen to write their own story in silence. He realized, with a clarity that made his breath catch, that this woman, this Rose, or whatever her name truly was both his destruction and his deliverance. And for the first time since the night of the fire, Clyde Baxter felt the stirrings of destiny, not as a curse, but as a promise, dangerous and irresistible. The desert wind rose, carrying with it the faint echo of approaching hooves, a reminder that their moment was fragile, borrowed. But still, as she held his gaze, her hand pressed firmly over his heart, he understood something simple, yet unshakable. Whatever she was, whatever she wanted, she was no longer a stranger in his story. She had already become the chapter he could not turn away from, the voice that would guide him into a future laced with both vengeance and love. And as the embers dimmed, Clyde realized there was no going back. The question was no longer whether she was angel or devil, but whether he was ready to surrender to the storm she carried, and whether in her presence he might finally discover the healing hidden within the fire of his own heart. The night deepened, wrapping its velvet silence around them, yet nothing could soften the sharpness of her words as she began to reveal the truth. Her lips, pale but steady, formed the names Clyde had been chasing through shadows and smoke. Thomas Kellerman, Marcus Wade, Samuel Cross. Each one fell into the desert air like a blade cutting into the fragile skin of his grief. He had searched for weeks, haunted by faces without names, tormented by whispers that died before reaching clarity. And here she was, speaking with certainty, as if she carried the weight of his vengeance already within her heart. Her eyes softened as she spoke, glinting with something almost tender, though the truth in her voice was sharp enough to bleed. "They destroyed more than just your ranch, Clyde. You were one piece of a game they've been playing for years. Burning, buying, stealing the land and lives of families who stood in their way." The words ignited fury in his chest, but beneath that fury stirred something different, something startlingly fragile. Relief. For the first time since the smoke had swallowed his father's dream, he was no longer stumbling in blindness. The names were real. His enemies had faces, power, weaknesses. The vague fire of grief crystallized into purpose, and in that purpose there was a strange kind of healing, like a wound finally being cleaned despite the sting. Yet even as anger flared, his gaze was drawn back to her face, to the way her dark hair slipped loose from the edge of her habit, to the glimmer of vulnerability hiding behind her strength. She was no longer Sister Rosalie, but Rose Delqua, her true name spoken with quiet defiance, like a vow made to the night itself. She told him of her father's death, of the lies woven to trap her into marriage, of how she had fled her own life to chase justice across state lines. Her voice trembled with memory, but each word rang with steel. Clyde listened, every syllable pressing against his raw heart, and for the first time he understood that her pain was a mirror of his own. They were bound not by chance, but by wounds carved from the same hand of cruelty. As she leaned closer, the firelight traced the delicate slope of her collarbone, her skin luminous against the darkness. "I can't fight them alone," she admitted, her hand brushing against his arm, sending sparks through nerves already alight with restless need. "They are too powerful, too connected. But you, Clyde, you have nothing left to lose. Together, we could end them." Her words carried a dangerous intimacy, not just a proposal of vengeance, but of alliance, of shared blood and trust. He should have recoiled, should have questioned every hidden motive, but instead he felt the ground shift beneath him. The thought of riding beside her, of fighting with her, burned hotter than the fire between them. The silence stretched, broken only by the sigh of the desert wind. Then, from far off, the thunder of hooves. Rose's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes sharpening into something lethal. "They've come," she whispered, her body coiling like a predator ready to strike. Clyde felt the old instinct rise within him, the weight of his Winchester rifle, the familiar rhythm of survival. But it was different now. He was not alone. The woman beside him moved like smoke, like a storm contained within flesh, her presence both unsettling and steadying all at once. When the riders appeared on the horizon, the desert seemed to tighten around them, the stars holding their breath as violence drew near. 3 men, armed and certain, their laughter carrying cruelly across the sand. Clyde's pulse quickened, not just with fear, but with something hotter, sharper, anticipation. He glanced at Rose, saw the faint smile curve her lips, dangerous and beautiful. "When I give the signal, take the one on the left," she murmured, her breath brushing his ear, her tone intimate even in the face of death. The warmth of her whisper slid into him like a secret vow, binding him to her in a way words could never undo. The next moments unfolded with the precision of fate. Rose stepped forward, her habit still cloaking her figure, her hands lifted in feigned surrender. Her voice, soft and trembling with false innocence, carried across the sand like a hymn. For a heartbeat, the men believed her. A sister of mercy lost in the night. And in that heartbeat she struck. The hidden derringer flashing silver, her shot splitting the night and felling their leader before his laughter could fade. Clyde's rifle answered, sharp and unyielding, dropping the rider to the left as if the desert itself demanded justice. The third turned to flee, but Rose's second shot chased him into eternity, her skill undeniable, terrifying, breathtaking. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. 3 bodies lay in the dust, and Clyde stared at the woman who had just revealed herself not as prey, but as predator. She moved with deadly grace, retrieving a telegram from the fallen leader's pocket, her eyes glinting as she read Cross's signature at the bottom. Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady and unflinching. "Now you see," she said softly, her words carrying both fire and balm. "They will not stop. Neither can we." Clyde's chest heaved, torn between awe and unease. He had imagined vengeance as a solitary path, a grim road he would walk alone. But standing beside her, beneath the eternal desert sky, he felt something more. An awakening. Rose was no ordinary woman, no fragile companion to shield. She was danger wrapped in beauty, fury cloaked in silk, and yet in her presence he felt more alive, more certain than he had in months. The night was no longer only about survival. It was about choosing to fight, to trust, to surrender to a force greater than his fear. And as the desert winds swept the last traces of gunpowder into the vast silence, Clyde knew the question had already shifted. It was no longer whether he should walk away from her, but whether he had the strength to walk away at all. For with every glance, every brush of her hand, every word she spoke, she was binding him to something fierce, something healing, something that felt dangerously like love. The stars seemed brighter now, the fire no longer their only light. And though the night carried danger still, Clyde Baxter felt the beginning of something he could not yet name, something that would lead them deeper into both vengeance and desire, something that promised to either save or consume them both. The bodies lay scattered in the sand, their silence heavier than gunfire, but the night did not pause to honor them. Rose's eyes gleamed as she knelt beside the fallen leader, the telegram trembling in her fingers like a living confession of betrayal. Clyde stood behind her, his rifle still warm, the echo of violence still humming in his veins. He told himself to stay alert, to watch for more danger, but his gaze betrayed him, drifting to the curve of her shoulders, the steady rhythm of her breath, the way the moonlight caught in her dark hair. She had killed with terrifying precision, yet there was no cruelty in her expression, only resolve, only the fire of someone who carried justice like a burden and vengeance like a vow. When she rose to her feet, the telegram still in her hand, her eyes found his and held them fast. "They've marked you for death, Clyde. Every shadow you see, every step you take, will be watched. You're no longer just a man seeking revenge. You're prey in their game." Her words struck like iron, but her voice carried a warmth that softened the blow, as though she were stitching healing into his wounds, even as she laid truth bare. He clenched his fists, his jaw set, but his heart betrayed him, beating not with fear, but with something sharper, drawn out by her presence. Hope, reckless and unsteady, but alive. She moved to her horse, hidden in the shadows, and with a fluid grace she shed her false skin. The habit slipped from her frame, replaced by black leather that clung to every curve, and the sight stole his breath. Gone was the illusion of piety, and before him stood Rose Delqua, no nun but a weapon forged in fire and secrets. Her hair cascaded free, dark waves framing a face both fierce and devastatingly beautiful. "Turn away," she murmured, her voice carrying a teasing challenge, though she knew he would not. He turned, yes, but only halfway, every nerve aware of her movements, every sound of shifting fabric searing itself into memory. When he faced her again, the desert seemed to pause, as if the stars themselves bent closer to see her unveiled. Clyde's mouth went dry, his heart pounding with something he could neither suppress nor fully embrace. She spoke then, her voice firm, but laced with sorrow. "I worked for the Pinkerton Agency. I hunted men like Cross, Wade, Kellerman. I served justice until justice betrayed me. My father was murdered because of what he uncovered. And when I tried to report the truth, they branded me a thief and marked me for elimination. So I became my own executioner, my own avenger. I disappeared into the dark so I could strike from it." Her confession hung in the air, heavy with grief, yet radiant with a strange kind of strength, the kind that comes when a soul refuses to break, no matter how deeply it is cut. Clyde felt something shift inside him, something deeper than anger, deeper even than desire. It was recognition, a bone-deep understanding of loss, of betrayal, of finding purpose in the ashes. She was like him, not untouched by sorrow, not innocent, but scarred, remade, and somehow stronger for it. And in that reflection, he found not only kinship, but a spark of healing, the beginning of a trust forged in pain. She stepped closer, her eyes glowing with firelight and moonlight both, and placed her hand against his chest, over the rhythm of his heart. "We can take them down," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Your strength, my skills. We're more dangerous together than they'll ever be apart. But I need to know if you can trust me, if you can fight beside me, if you can survive what's coming without losing yourself." Her thumb brushed lightly across his jaw, a touch that was more intimate than any kiss, and he felt his chest tighten, his soul leaning toward hers even as his mind warned him of the peril. He caught her hand, pressing it firmly against his chest as if to bind her to him. "What choice do I have?" he murmured, his voice rough with both weariness and longing. "They've taken everything. If I walk away, I'm already dead. But with you—" He hesitated, his eyes drinking her in, the curve of her lips, the storm in her gaze. "With you, I might find something worth living for again." Her smile unfurled slowly, dangerous and tender all at once, like dawn breaking after a long night. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." And then, without hesitation, her lips brushed his cheek. A fleeting kiss that burned hotter than any fire, searing into him a promise unspoken. It was not yet love, but the beginning of it, fierce and fragile, carried on the wind of danger. The desert was not quiet for long. From the distance came the roll of thunder. No storm clouds in sight, only the sound of hooves, reinforcements rushing under Cross's command. Rose's eyes sharpened again, deadly and focused. "We have to move." There's an abandoned mine to the south, hidden and defensible. We'll rest there, plan, prepare." She turned swiftly, her figure a blur of dark grace as she mounted her horse. Clyde followed, swinging into the saddle with the weight of fate pressing at his back. As they rode together into the silver wash of moonlight, leaving behind the bodies and the ashes of the night's battle, Clyde felt the first thread of something new winding through the ruin of his heart. Not just vengeance, not just survival, but partnership. A dangerous, intoxicating bond that promised both ruin and redemption. He glanced at Rose riding beside him, her hair streaming like dark fire, her presence both a balm and a blade. For the first time since the ranch burned, he did not feel alone. He felt chosen, guided, perhaps even healed by the very storm that threatened to consume him. And as the desert stretched wide and endless before them, their fates already intertwined, Clyde knew with a clarity that shook him. He would not turn away from her, no matter what blood was spilled, no matter what shadows they had to face. He was already hers, bound by fire, by grief, by the perilous, irresistible pull of desire. And the night carried them forward, deeper into danger, deeper into one another, toward a destiny neither could escape. The abandoned mine opened like a black seam in the earth, a wound the moon had stitched shut with silver. They reached it just before dawn, when the desert held its softest breath, when the chill carried a kindness the day would soon burn away. Rose swung from the saddle first, a fluid line of motion that made the sand seem to obey her feet. Clyde dismounted slower, his muscles protesting, his ribs tight with the strain of a night that had asked too much and somehow given more. Inside, the mine held a hush that felt almost sacred. Old timbers, rough and scarred, framed a tunnel wide enough for two to walk shoulder to shoulder. There was a spring near the entrance, Clyde had remembered true, and its trickle threaded the silence with a healing sound, the desert's quiet confession. He knelt and cupped the water in his hands. It was cold, sweet as a promise he barely dared to believe. Rose crouched beside him, and when their shoulders touched, neither moved away. They worked without speaking at first, a rhythm forming between them as naturally as shadows follow light. Clyde stabled the horses in a side chamber and spread their blankets on a patch of level ground. Rose gathered dry brush and lit a modest flame that kept its glow tight and respectful. In the fire's small warmth, she began to unlace one glove, and that simple, unhurried motion caught his breath. From the bullet-black night to this gentle unraveling, he felt his heart shift, as if some stubborn, broken gear had finally found its seat. "You're bleeding," she said, eyes dipped, but voice steady. Her finger hovered near his shirt where a crease of crimson showed. "It's nothing," he answered, stubborn by habit. She raised an eyebrow. "Men who say that usually die of nothing." Her hands, steady, sure, undid the buttons, one by one, as if she were opening a book she intended to read cover to cover. She did not look away from the bruise blooming along his ribs, nor from the shallow graze that had seared him during the gunfight. She cleaned the wound with water, tore a strip from an underscarf, and pressed the cloth in careful increments, each touch tender, clinical, intimate. Clyde watched her work, his world narrowing to the fragrance of jasmine and wood smoke, to the warmth of her breath when she leaned closer, to the bright grit of pain that softened beneath her patience. "You've done this before," he murmured. "More times than I like, she said, binding the cloth with a knot neat as a signature. Pain teaches what peace often forgets. It was a line he might have argued with on another night. Here it sounded like truth. They ate sparingly, dried meat, a heel of bread, a strip of smoked apple that carried the whisper of orchards far from this burnt land. When they finished, Rose set the telegram on the ground between them like an altar. The paper still bore the smear where Cross's name had clipped the heel of a fallen boot. In the growing light, the ink seemed to crawl. "Cross escalates when cornered," she said, voice low. "He thinks quick and punishes quicker. Wade finances the fire. Oil, water rights, freight. Kellerman launders the money through paper that looks pious and men who say grace." "And us?" Clyde asked. "Where do we stand?" "On the narrow ridge between what we want and what we can live with." She held his gaze. "If we're going to destroy them, we need to take their breath first, not their throat. Cut the lines that feed their lungs." Telegraphs. Ledgers. Couriers. Confidence. Clyde leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and traced an invisible map in the dust. The names sounded less like mountains now, and more like doors. "Wade's men keep the kerosene in a quarry barn off Dean's Wash. He rotates guards every 2 nights. There's a blind curve in the arroyo. You can approach without skylining. If we torch the supply, he'll pay to replenish. If we steal the ledgers and deliver them to the right eyes, he'll bleed." "The right eyes?" she echoed, mouth curving without humor. "Newspapers who still remember their oath. A judge who hasn't sold the robe. I know 2 editors in Tucson who are tired of swallowing ash and calling it bread. But editors need proof, and proof needs witnesses." She studied him a moment longer than a plan required. "This is where it becomes a covenant. You'll see the worst of me before this is done." "I already have," he said. His voice surprised them both with its softness. "And I'm still here." Her answer was not a smile, at least not the kind the world would recognize. It lived in her eyes, a quiet loosening, a surrender shaped like trust. She drew a small leather portfolio from her pack and opened it to reveal thin pages crowded with tight, meticulous hand. Names, dates, amounts, an anatomized sin that spanned 2 years and 3 states. "My father kept notes," she said. The words were careful, like stepping stones across a fast river. "These are copies. The originals died with him, or so Cross believes. If we move fast, if we stitch this paper to witnesses and nail it where the town can't avoid it, Kellerman's flock will wake to a sermon he never meant to preach." Clyde reached for a page. On it, he read a figure that matched the amount his supplier had insisted upon the week before the fire, paid by Wade's factor. Not a coincidence. A ledger wound that matched his scar. He felt rage sparking again, yes, but something else braided into it now. Alignment. As if the universe, long misthreaded, was finally slipping onto the right teeth of the gear. Rose refolded the portfolio and tucked it away. "Before we move, you need to rest." She glanced toward the tunnel mouth, where the day was glazing the desert with pale gold. "We sleep while the sun watches. We ride when it blinks." Clyde should have argued. He didn't. The mine air was cool and clean in a way that felt like forgiveness. He stretched out on the blanket. She lay beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the gravity of her. The little fire crackled like a heartbeat trying to be brave. Somewhere deeper in the mine, water kept its vow to flow, He drifted, and in that soft descent he saw his father's hands, work rough, steady, lifting a beam, setting a post, shaping shelter out of stubborn land. He saw them again, transfigured, as Rose's hands binding him back to himself. When he woke, hours later, the heat had gentled, and she was sitting with her back to a timber, cleaning her derringer with a care that looked like prayer. "How long?" He scrubbed his face, eyes adjusting. "Long enough to dream," she said, as if she'd seen him do it. He rose and joined her. They spoke in the shorthand of people who'd learned each other's edges by the violence of a single night. She taught him the hand signs she preferred in the dark. Stop, wait, left, right, eyes. He showed her the trick of rolling a foot so the gravel would whisper instead of complain, the way to check a wind shift with a wetted knuckle, the glimmer line a rider casts when he crosses against a moon that favours no man. They rehearsed what he'd seen of the quarry barn, built a sequence until it felt inevitable. Approach under the lip of the wash, neutralize the outer watch, steal the ledgers, salt the oil with lamp black to mark future shipments, leave a message on the wall in a hand. Cross would recognize but not trace. A wound that looked like warning but bit like evidence. Near dusk they ate again, and after, a softer silence settled. The kind not born of exhaustion, but of the wordless recognition that tomorrow now had shape because they had given it one. Rose watched the last light lean across the tunnel mouth, and in that slant her features gentled, young and mortal under all the polish of training and rage. "My father taught me to pick locks with a hairpin," she said, almost smiling at the memory that arrived with her words. "He called it an honest sin. The day I found him, I thought I would never forgive the world for the sound it made when hope broke." Clyde didn't speak. He didn't touch her yet, but his silence was not emptiness. It was space held deliberately, like a palm open to catch what she wanted to place there. She turned to him, and the mind's little fire painted amber along her cheek. "I've kept moving since. That's how I stayed alive. Keep moving, keep striking, keep breathing through the pain, until last night." She inhaled as if the air itself were a risk. "Last night I stopped. You found me. You looked at me like I wasn't a ghost of my own making." He reached out then, not to claim, only to anchor, his fingers resting lightly over hers. Heat moved between them in a slow, even current. "I thought I was the one learning how to breathe again," he said. "Turns out I've been waiting for someone who remembered the rhythm." For a long moment they were only breath and pulse. The desert beyond the tunnel hushed, as if agreeing to hold watch while they relearned what it meant to be human. When Rose spoke again, the steel in her voice had not left. It had simply found a softer sheath. "If I lose myself in this," she said, "pull me back." "If I try to walk into the fire alone," he answered, "pull me out." Her lips tipped, nearly a smile. "Deal." What followed was not a kiss urgent with fear or starved by long denial. It was the opposite, patient, deliberate, a vow spoken in contact rather than words. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his, until the small places, the corners of mouths, the brush of noses, the space where breath becomes shared, knew each other. When their lips met, it was gentle first, then surer, like a door that opens with no squeal, because it has been oiled by trust. His hand cupped her jaw, hers slid to his shoulder, careful of the bandage she herself had tied. The kiss was not an end or a beginning. It was a seam, two lives stitched together where they had torn. When they drew apart, the mine felt larger, as if the earth itself had exhaled. Rose did not step away. She studied him in that careful way of hers, as though she were counting the small mercies the world had finally granted both of them. "There's a question I'll ask you," she said, more promise than threat. "Not now, not while the light still listens. Later, when the dark makes us honest and the danger is close enough to taste. I'll ask, and I'll want the truth." "Ask," he said, the word hoarse with 1,000 unsaid yeses. "Later," she repeated, and the faintest spark, mischief or mercy, touched her mouth. She rose, tugging him with her. "Come, dusk is here. Time to ghost the quarry." They doused the fire with a careful hand, shook out the last heat until the ashes cooled like a heartbeat, slipping into sleep. Horses tacked, saddles cinched, waterskins checked, a choreography that, done together, felt almost like a prayer. Outside, the desert wore its lavender dress, sage shadowed and sweet, sky washed wide and forgiving. The first star pricked open, one clear eye watching. They rode at a pace that kept their lungs grateful. Clyde led along the wash, choosing the softer ground where hoofprints blur. Rose rode a length behind, her eyes everywhere and nowhere, seeing more than he could, exactly as he had hoped. When they reached the bend where the arroyo folded into itself, they slid to the ground and let the horses breathe. The quarry barn sat 200 yards ahead, a box of weathered boards hunched against the slope, a single lantern already hung to persuade the dark to show its hands. Clyde nodded once. Rose answered with the sign for wait. She went still as stone, listening with every part of her, ears, skin, the alert wire strung down the spine of all living things that have survived the hunt. Satisfied, she looked back and gave him the sign for two guards. They moved. Gravel whispered, but did not complain, and their shadows kept their secrets. At the corner of the barn, Rose held up a palm, then pointed left. A figure slumped on a crate, rifle across his knees, the lazy arrogance of a man who thinks his name is never the one written on the telegram. Clyde drew a breath and let it out slow. "On 3, Rose mouthed. On 3, they were the night. It was quick and clean. Clyde's forearm silenced the shout that might have risen. Rose's sap kissed the base of the skull with a compassion that left no bruise the daylight would describe. They eased the body down as if laying a child to sleep. The second guard, at the rear, never turned far enough to learn a new lesson. When he sagged into the straw, the silence returned the favor of courtesy. Locks were old friends to Rose. A hairpin, of course she carried one, met the padlock with a small, delighted sound, and the hasp surrendered a moment later. Inside, ledger boxes stacked like altars waited for believers. Clyde felt the old rage trying to crowd his chest. He gave it something to hold, purpose, and moved with calm hands. They opened 3 boxes, took 5 books, slipped 2 packets of invoices into Rose's satchel, lampblack feathered into 3 unopened tins, a signature only a trained eye would notice when the flames ran ugly later. On the inside wall, Rose paused. From her jacket, she pulled a stub of charcoal and, with a stroke that was both delicate and condemnatory, wrote a single line where men carry their eyes when they enter a room. Proof doesn't burn. They resealed what they could, rewound what they had unwound, and ghosted the way they'd come. At the wash, they remounted. Behind them, the barn held its breath like a liar about to swear the truth. Ahead, the desert opened. They didn't race. They flowed. The night was theirs, and would be generous until it wasn't. They knew better than to spend its gift in one gallop. When the mine-mouth reappeared, a dark promise in a paler dark, they let the horses drink, then slipped inside with their prizes. Only then did Rose allow herself a small, satisfied exhale. She set the ledgers out, fanned like playing cards between conspirators who already know how the hand ends. "Tomorrow," she said, fingertips resting lightly on the inked columns, "we stitch this to the editors." Then Cross wakes to a world that has learned his language and refuses to speak it. Clyde reached for her hand without ceremony. "We wake to it too." She laced her fingers with his, a simple act more binding than any vow spoken in church. The mine received their quiet, and the desert above kept their secret. Somewhere a coyote wrote a brief lyric to the moon. Somewhere a telegraph clicked a lie that would die in daylight. Rose looked up, and that other smile, the one the world might never earn, found him. The question hovered at the edge of her eyes, not yet asked, not yet owed. He felt ready for it anyway. "Sleep a little," she said, and the way she said it was a benediction. "Dream about a world after fire." He lay back. She lay beside him. Between them, the ledgers waited. Within them, a future stirred. Dangerous, luminous, alive. The night gathered close, tender as a hand over a fevered brow, and carried them toward the hour when plans harden into destiny, and a whispered question becomes a truth spoken out loud. Night thinned to a grey ribbon at the edge of the earth, and with it came the sound of men who thought noise could keep truth from finding them. Wade roared before the sun was up. Orders hurled like stones, doors slammed, the rattle and clatter of crates being dragged across his yard as if motion itself could undo what ink had made. From the lip of the arroyo, Clyde and Rose watched the freight yard seethe. Lanterns swung wild. A foreman stumbled from office to platform with papers clutched to his chest, gestures flaring, mouth working hard as if he could chew fear into smaller, swallowable pieces. "He'll set a fire to hide the first," Rose said softly. "Men who worship flame forget it has a memory." "Then we let the memory speak," Clyde answered. They moved like dawn shadows, present and unthreatening until you try to grasp them. The town, already wakeful from yesterday's hymn of presses, stretched around them with a different posture today. Not stiff with fear, but braced, like a body choosing to stand up. At the corner by the Sentinel, a knot of men read an extra sheet tacked to the wall. Diaz and Albright had pared their teeth for a second bite. Wade's name had grown heavier. Kellerman's looked paler under print. Rose and Clyde slipped behind the feed store and crossed the lane to the freight yard's back fence. The lampblack they had dusted, delicate, invisible in certain light, now told a visible story. Finger marks smudged along the window latch and the door Wade had yanked at in his fury. The loosened hinge pin had tilted the door just enough to eat his balance, and the gouge it carved in the jamb had a fresh, ugly honesty to it. "Evidence with a little poetry," Rose murmured, and for the first time that morning a smile warmed her voice. They stepped inside when the foreman shouted, and the yard's eyes went the other way. Rose's hairpin kissed the lock. The ledger cabinet breathed open like a relieved confession. Clyde lifted one book, then another. A quick glance confirmed what they needed to know. Pages were gone, torn with haste. So Wade had tried to edit yesterday. The beauty of ledgers is the space they leave behind announces the crime as clearly as the writing ever did. Rose set a folded note where the missing leaves had been, her handwriting neat as a sermon title, "Mind the Gaps." Then she slid their own copies, yesterday's rescued ledgers, deep into the cabinet's lower drawer, where a deputy with a patient eye would find them. Truth seeded in a dishonest garden has a way of sprouting at the perfect hour. Shouts spiked beyond the wall. Smoke shouldered up from the barn across the yard. Wade had thrown a lamp. Fire licked straw and then ran, greedy, but lamp-black, brushed into the oil the night before, turned the flames sullen and oily, spitting a mean black smoke, an accusing banner that drifted streetward and called witnesses as it went. By the time Wade realized the spectacle he'd created, men were already running with blankets and pumps. A deputy shouted for order. Albright himself arrived with ink still on his cuffs and an expression that could cut rope. Rose and Clyde did not hero their way into that crowd. Instead, they walked out the gate like people who had done nothing more than check on a delayed shipment, turned north at the church where women stood in their aprons, watching the smoke with faces that said enough, and drank water at the public pump. The town hummed through them. Whispers braided into decisions, worry tempered by a growing appetite for consequence. Healing happens like that sometimes, not all at once, not with a trumpet, but with 100 small realignments that teach a place how to hold itself again. "Kellerman?" Clyde asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, eyes angling toward the bank's tidy facade. "Running men always pretend to stroll first," Rose said. "Come." They took the side street that smelled of lemon oil and lies. Outside the bank, a buggy waited with 2 fine wheels and a trunk too heavy for a gentleman's afternoon. 2 porters answered to a junior clerk's frantic hands. Rose looped her arm through Clyde's like any ranch wife walking with her man and mounted the bank steps as if her name were on the deed. Inside, the air was polished and false. Kellerman stood at his desk, smoothing his features into neutrality each time they slipped toward panic. He was a handsome man, in the way fresh bread is handsome, nourishing to look at, empty when you knock the bottom and hear it hollow. "Mr. Kellerman," Rose said, warmth poured smooth into her voice. "Have you a moment for a donation? My husband and I would like to contribute to your relief fund. You've been so public-spirited." Kellerman's shoulders loosened a fraction, conditioned by years of adoration to relax at praise. "Of course," he said, already moving to the drawer where he kept receipts, already making the mistake she wanted. He put his hand where guilty men always put it, on the double book. Her smile didn't change. "That ledger seems busy. Perhaps the other one is free." He hesitated a breath. Too long. The deputy behind them, Albright had fetched him as planned, arriving with a newspaper tucked under his arm like a warrant, stepped forward, hat in his hand, politeness sharpened into duty. "Sir, I'll be needing a look at both of those books." 2 more men followed, one grey, one brown, both with the quiet weight of citizens who have decided to be heavier on purpose today. Kellerman blustered and bled denials that sounded like wind in tin. The deputy's face remained merciful and unmovable. When the drawers opened, the story wrote itself. Duplicates with different numbers singing two hymns in clashing keys. The clerk with the new eyes stared and swallowed. Truth rearranged something in his chest he would never permit to be undone again. Clyde wasn't watching Kellerman's hands now. He was watching Rose's face as she watched the town do what it was built to do, correct itself. For a second, the steel in her gaze softened to silver. He saw the girl who had once believed in institutions before men made of cloth had tried to buy her silence with lace. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The warmth that moved between them then had learned a new way to travel, like air in a room where someone has finally opened the right window. By afternoon, the bank's door bore a notice. Under investigation. People read it without glee. Glee is for games. This was relief, sober and steady, the kind a body feels when a fever breaks and sweat cools the skin. Wade, deprived of his fire's easy alibi, roared himself hoarse, then sent a runner to the sheriff to complain of slander. The runner arrived to find the sheriff reading, lips moving, jaw tightening. "Slander's a word that needs a lie to live on," the sheriff said, and the runner carried that answer back like a stone in his pocket. It would have been a clean day if the world were kind on schedule. But Cross did not do clean. Near dusk, the telegraph operator's hands shook as he tacked a note on the office board. Reward, private, deliver in person. The number written below it was the sort that makes bad men smarter and good men tempted. Cross had reached a hand across distance and tried to buy the night. Rose read the figure and exhaled slowly. "He'll send professionals and amateurs both," she said. "The worst of each." "We draw the former out," Clyde said, "so the latter have no one to follow." They rode at twilight, a flush of rose along the horizon naming the hour after her. The air held a sweetness at odds with danger, mesquite bloom and the faint green breath that rises from irrigation ditches when the day carries mercy in the shallow water. They didn't speak except to warn of a hole or to point at a hawk kiting the ridge. Silence between them had learned how to be companion and not judge. The first man came at the old toll bridge, a figure too casual in the wrong place. His hat brim sat like a decision. Rose's hand lifted a fraction. Clyde's reins tightened. When the man stepped out to block the planks with a smile that wanted to be friendly and failed, they were already dismounting, already splitting, so his eyes would have to choose a threat and mischoose. "Evening," he said, palm open, a snake shaping itself into a gesture. "Roads closed." "Then the water's open," Rose replied, tone pleasant, steps sensibly light. The man turned just enough that Clyde saw the telltale. A gun worn too low, the draw too rehearsed for a ranch hand. Rose's hat tipped. The derringer laughed once. He folded without drama, a man surprised to discover he'd been mortal all along. They dragged him under the bridge and gave the river the gun, because sometimes water is the only honest witness. 3 miles farther, 2 more waited in mesquite, patience better than skill. They got a shot off, wild, scared by the quiet that rode before Rose and Clyde like a scout. The reply was measured, a single mark pressed into the twilight. One ran, one knelt with his hands up because the courage he had brought wasn't the kind that could survive seeing its own reflection. "You can walk home," Clyde said, voice even. "Tell Cross we prefer letters to bullets. He's better at those." They kept moving. The mine's mouth took them in again, that faithful arch of stone greeting them like a porch lamp left on. They fed the horses and fed themselves, and sat with their backs to the timber, letting the day settle inside them without rust. When sleep came, it came in pieces, as it does before a storm. Clyde woke to Rose standing at the tunnel mouth, moonlight laying a silver stola across her shoulders. He went to her without words. Outside, the desert sighed, a sound like pages turned in a book somebody loved enough to read slowly. "Do you miss who you were?" he asked, surprised by his own question as it rose. She considered the horizon. "No," she said. "I miss who I thought the world was. Then I meet it like this." She gestured toward the town's distant glow. "And realize it can still learn. That soothes more than memory." He stood beside her until the horizon softened from iron to pewter. Her hand found his, fingers cool from night, strong with life. The peace between them was not fragile. It had earned its calm, like a horse that will stand steady when thunder walks over the hills. The next day carried a different music. Deputies with tired eyes and clean collars visited Wade's office with warrants that hardened the air. The fingerprint soot told its story in black kisses no lawyer could scrub. At the bank, customers withdrew not just money, but permission. A line of farmers with sun-creased faces looked Kellerman in the eye and found they could hold his gaze without shrinking. Authority was renegotiating its contract, line by line. By noon, a telegraph spat a final furious stanza from New Orleans: "Deny, deflect, destroy." Cross had changed his pen, traded Sunday's sanctimony for the language of men who hire wolves and call them dogs. The sheriff folded the paper with a sigh and called for a posse, not with show, but with names. Men came. Some women, too, aprons over house dresses, faces set. Albright posted another sheet. Diaz sharpened another paragraph. The town's heart learned a steadier beat. Clyde and Rose rode to the abandoned mission south of San Miguel by late afternoon, because rumors magnetized to ruins, and they'd heard a whisper that Cross's professionals liked its shadows. The place had the melancholy of holy houses left to weather, the bells gone, the door a polite ruin, pigeons offering pale prayers from the rafters. They stepped inside with the quiet you bring to such places, even when you do not know the prayers. Dust stirred in long shafts of light. The altar had been stripped, but not of its silence. "Good place for an end," Rose said, not morbidly, simply naming a symmetry. They found the men in the sacristy, 3, clean boots, blank eyes, the kind of courtesy that makes a room colder. What followed was quick and precise. No speeches, no theatre. Rose moved like a blade with a memory. Clyde answered, as if they'd rehearsed it for years in a life they were only now remembering. When the last of the 3 realized he was still breathing, he set his gun down and sat on a broken pew with his hands loose between his knees like a boy who had finally understood something hard. "Why?" he asked, voice small, looking not at them, but at the crucifix shadow that still clung to the wall. "Because what you serve eats its own," Rose said gently. "You know it. Choose better." They left him there with his breath and left the mission with the door pulled mostly to, as if keeping weather from places still tender with prayer. At dusk, the ridge above town burned peach and then bruised itself plum. They stopped at the overlook again, looking down at the little lights and the long street and the stir that had become a healthier kind of motion. Clyde reached for Rose's hand without thinking, and she gave it without ceremony. The silence held them like warm water. He felt distinct as a bell the moment his life turned from pain toward meaning, not because injury had been avenged, but because love had learned where to place itself in the world and found a hearth. After, he said, the word a soft bridge. When cross is a name, we speak only to remind ourselves what not to become. What then? Her head tilted, considering, as if tasting the word after for the first time in months. We rebuild, she said. Not the old shape. Something honest to what we've learned. Fewer walls, more doors, rooms where a stranger can sleep because you trust the good in the road more than the fear in your bones. I want that, he said simply. I know, she answered, and her knowing soothed him more than any promise. Below them, a bell rang from the courthouse. 1, 2, 3, 4. A signal agreed upon that afternoon. Wade under arrest. The sound carried up the slope like fresh wind. Rose closed her eyes, just for a breath, and let the note pass through her. When she opened them, they were wet, not from sorrow, but from the particular relief that follows long-held strain. Healing, clean, and quiet. The night embraced them gently as they turned their horses toward the mine one last time. Tomorrow, Rose said, voice low, we ride east. Cross won't come here. Pride won't let him. He'll expect us to run. We won't. No, Clyde said, the word fitting him now like a worn glove. We'll finish what they started when they lit the first match. They rode side by side, and the desert, pleased with the symmetry, unspooled a path that seemed to have been waiting for their hooves all along. Somewhere far behind them, presses cooled and deputies wrote neat lines in their books. Somewhere ahead, a river threw a thread of silver across the dark, like a promise to thirsty men. Between those two somewheres, they moved with the unhurried certainty of people who have chosen truth and learned it will walk at their pace. They did not speak of fear. They did not need to. It was there, yes, but like a distant weather on someone else's horizon. What lay close was steadier. The warmth of hands that had learned each other's shape, the quiet click and sigh of leather, the intimate rhythm their horses' footfalls had invented and taught them. At the mine, they doused their small lamp and found their blankets by memory. Rose lay with her palm resting light on Clyde's chest, feeling the measured rise and fall of the breath that had once been a ragged prayer. He covered her hand with his own. In that simple shelter, the world outside could bruise and break and threaten, and still a center would hold. Tomorrow, she whispered, mouth close to his ear, words like warm tea on a cold morning. Justice finishes its circle. Tomorrow, he echoed, surrendering to the kind of sleep that only comes when a heart is done arguing with itself. The night held them, tender and vigilant, and turned the earth once more toward the dawn that would carry them to the last name on their list, and the first morning of a life built from more than ash. They rode as the horizon unstitched itself from the night, eastward where the land softened and the air learned the language of river water. For days the world changed its face, cactus giving way to cottonwood, dust yielding to low grasses that remembered rain, sky trading the hard blue of deserts for a gentler, washed silk. They spoke little. saving words the way travellers save sugar. But when they did, it was with a new ease, sentences that rested their heads on each other without weight. In the quiet, they counted small mercies. A heron lifting like a benediction from a marsh. 2 deer looking up together without bolting. Rose's laugh when a foal tried to kick the wind and startled itself into a sidestep that looked like joy. Cross's wires clawed after them and fell behind, threads that snapped on the teeth of place names and deputies who had learned to read their own town's reflections. In one city, a sheriff pinned the printed proofs to the jailhouse door like a hymn nailed, where even the illiterate could feel the shape of justice. In another, a judge read by lamplight until dawn and told his clerk to fetch the boldest bailiff he knew. Justice was travelling, on foot, on paper, on breath. They reached the river at sundown, the water bruised purple and gold, a slow-breathing creature too wide to fear one man's name. New Orleans lay ahead like a jewelled dare, balconies and lace iron, lanterns stitched along streets that smelled of sugar and secrets. Music threaded the dusk, a trumpet crying like a gull, a piano warming a parlour where people forgot sorrow for a song and remembered it again when the last note said, "Wait." Rose stood in her stirrups and looked a long time, eyes deep and steady. She would not hurry into a city that had once tried to swallow her whole. "Cross knows we're here," she said finally, not as a warning, but as a fact she placed on the table between them. "He won't make the first move. He'll arrange the room, the witness, the angle of light. Then he'll wait for us to enter, as if we were guests at his own absolution." "Then we enter like owners," Clyde said, "of ourselves, of the truth." They slept in a courtyard inn where bougainvillea dropped pink confetti on the flagstones, and a cat moved like a rumour between table legs. In the morning, they became the people the city needed them to be. Rose in dove-grey silk, hair pinned with a sparrow's modesty, eyes hidden beneath a veil that turned her gaze into a private ocean. Clyde in a coat he borrowed from a man who had once owned a dance hall and later learned to read ledgers better than faces. They looked like money with a conscience, like trouble wearing a ring. Cross's townhouse sat back from the street as if it were embarrassed by how much it cost. Gas lamps burned steady even in daylight. 2 guards at the gate wore livery with the calm of men who believe the world is a hallway they've been paid to stand in. Rose took Clyde's arm, not for show alone, and climbed the steps as if she had been invited every day for a year and had declined each time from boredom. "Good morning," she said to the butler, who opened the door and discovered that politeness could be a blade. "Kindly inform Mr. Cross that the woman who declined his engagement has come to discuss the return of his borrowed future." Silence. Then the small surrender of a jaw that recognizes a proper noun dressed as a person. They were led into a room designed to make a man's sins look tasteful. Rugs like dusk, portraits that stared through you to a hand mirror of their own vanity, French doors breathing cool garden scent into heat that had been bottled for privilege. Clyde felt the house's weight and, beneath it, a vibration, like rails waking to a far-off train. Truth was coming, and the floorboards knew it. Cross entered with care, as if he feared the air might catch him at an unflattering angle. He was handsome in the way portraits are after the artist has been paid, his smile a manuscript written by other men's hunger. For a moment, seeing him, Clyde understood how a city might have believed the lie. Good teeth, easy shoulders, a Sunday's voice. Then Cross's eyes found Rose, and all the varnish slid. Greed looks like longing to the untrained heart. To trained eyes, it looks like a mouth that never learned the word enough. "Rose," he said, allowing himself the intimacy of her first name, as if it had always been his to keep. "You're alive." An unexpected grace. "A predictable disappointment," she answered, removing her gloves finger by finger with a patience that rippled through the room. "I admit I wanted you to be better at erasing what doesn't belong to you." Cross laughed, a clean sound with a bad aftertaste. "You taught me the pleasure of a challenge. But here you are, and here I am. Your father's death was unfortunate. Business at scale generates accidents. Also," he glanced at Clyde as if appraising a horse, "your taste has shifted from polished to provincial." Clyde felt the old anger flare. Rose's touch on his wrist smoothed it the way a hand smooths a startled horse's neck. She did not look at Cross when she spoke next. She looked at the window where the garden shimmered like a soft excuse. "Samuel," she said, and the use of his given name undressed him more efficiently than any insult. "You ordered men burned out of their lives. You bribed clerks with money and preachers with speeches. You turned honest land into a ledger. You bled at will. We stitched proof to witnesses and ink, and the territory has found its posture again. Kneel to it, and maybe you keep your skin." Cross's smile sharpened. "You forget where you stand. In this city, I am the posture. Editors won't print. Judges drink my wine. Men who ride for my rivals sleep in my guest rooms. And you—" He leaned forward, a softness that felt like velvet over a blade. "You still blush under silk. Will you forgive me, Rose? Shall we marry at last and let the past call itself mistaken? I could forgive you your temper. I could forgive you this companion." Clyde's hand moved before thought arrived. Not to his gun, to his chest, where a letter lay folded that had ridden in his pocket since Tucson, the last copy of a ledger entry with Cross's own flourish across the margin. "Expedite." He placed it on the polished table as if setting down bread. Then he added another. A telegram Diaz had authenticated, the cadence cruel and familiar. No witnesses. The butler's breath snagged. Even rugs can feel the weight of a true thing placed upon them. "Your house has ears," Clyde said, voice mild, gaze steady. "It also has eyes that are tired of looking at expensive lies." Rose didn't move. Cross did, but only inward, 2 steps toward a precipice inside himself. He recover-schooled his mouth into charm. "This is theatre. You've always loved the stage, Rose. Very well. Let us perform the 3rd act properly." He clapped once. The doors opened. 2 men stepped in from the garden, broad, unremarkable in a way that means trouble when you see it in daylight. Another entered behind them carrying a ledger shaped like a prayer book. Cross's tone was honey. "See? I too can summon proof. The Pinkertons would be very interested to hear what their former employee has been doing in their name. Trespass, theft, seduction surely, the charity you use to hunt. Perhaps they'll accept a trade, my patience for your freedom. Perhaps you'll accept it too." Rose smiled then. The calm, terrible mercy of a woman who has already measured a man and found no surprises left. She reached to the pearl at her ear and unhooked it. The room learned a new sound. the soft insect hum of a wire that had been taking dictation since the butler had shown them in. "Samuel," she said, almost tender, "the world doesn't revolve around your house. It revolves around consequence." Outside, at the curb, a carriage creaked. At the corner, a newsboy's shout braided with the clack of a constable's boots. Somewhere on the block, a door opened with purpose. Rose walked to the French doors and pushed them wide. The garden smelled of citrus and money. In that sweet air, she became very simply herself. No disguise, no burnished steel, only a woman who had refused to break and was tired of seeing men confuse her tenderness for a door. "Listen," she said. Cross wanted to pretend he couldn't. He couldn't. The city had heard itself. Presses woken by midnight copy, a judge who'd finished his glass and started moving his pen, a captain who owed Albright a favour and Diaz an apology. It came in pieces, the cough of a wagon wheel, the measured plural of boots, the low voice of a man announcing his name like a lantern. "Sheriff." The men beside Cross looked at him and discovered their pay didn't cover this. "Choice," Rose said, turning back, voice steady as a bell. "You love to offer it when the other person has none. Here is yours. In your study, you sign the statement that places you beneath your own hand, and you come quietly, a man acknowledging gravity. Or you reach for theatre, and I let this city see how a powerful man falls who believed falling could be staged." Cross's gaze flicked to Clyde, to the ledger, to the garden. The angle of his jaw changed. A boy remembered, a father misremembered, a Sunday that stained. For a breath he was human. Then he chose the script he'd been rehearsing since he learned other people were furniture. He lunged for the ledger with the suddenness of a wind that snaps a line. Rose's hand moved, not to the derringer, but to the table. She lifted the ledger and stepped aside. Cross, off balance, missed the catch and collided with the polished edge. An ugly sound, some mix of wood and pride. One guard drew. Clyde's voice cracked the air without yelling, "Don't!" The man saw something in Clyde's eyes that didn't belong to threats, something steadier, kinder, more final, and he let the gun fall like a tired argument. The second guard turned, intent on escape, and found Albright and Diaz in the doorway with a constable between them, journal and warrant held like sacraments. Cross saw the four corners of his world and tried to grind them into a circle that would fit his hand. He failed. The ledger lay open, the signature arched across it, vain as a peacock. Rose placed her fingertip beneath the line, as though explaining a lesson to a child. "There," she said softly. "The flourish killed you." He sagged then, not to his knees. Pride wouldn't bend that far, but to the truth. The constable stepped forward with cuffs that had touched silk before. Diaz's gaze flicked to Rose and warmed. Albright's found Clyde and did the same. Outside, New Orleans went on breathing. The pianist rolled a chord and smiled at his own cleverness. A child dropped a stick into a gutter river and chased it half a block. A woman lifted a basket to her hip and thought of soup. The city did not stop for one man's fall. That was the lesson Cross had never learned, and everyone else already knew. Paperwork came next, the dull sacrament of order. Rose endured it with patience that had learned to be gentle with itself. When it was done, when Cross had been escorted down the steps under a sky so blue it felt like a dare, when the constable had nodded to Diaz and Albright like men who had shared something more intimate than a secret, Rose and Clyde walked out into the hot street and let the sun lay its hand on their faces. They didn't speak. The noise around them was a balm. Vendors hawking, wheels complaining, a sparrow arguing with a bigger bird and winning by wit. At the corner, the newsboy shouted a headline he didn't fully understand yet, and would tell his grandchildren with full understanding decades from now. Clyde bought a paper and did not open it. He rolled it, tapped it against his palm, and thought of his father, of ash, of water, of the feel of a ledger page under his thumb when truth peels off a man's mask like old varnish. On the levee, the river took their reflections and stretched them long, then snapped them back again, amused. They stood there a while, not touching, a nearness that had no job but to be itself. Eventually, Rose put her head against his shoulder and breathed the way a heart does when it has learned that mercy is not a myth. He kissed her hair without ceremony. The taste of the city, sugar and iron and sweat and trumpet brass, sat on his tongue like an honest meal. "After," he said again, the word now a room they could furnish. "What do you want?" Her answer surprised them both with its simplicity. "A porch, the kind that invites a neighbor to sit without explaining why they came, a kitchen that smells of coffee at dawn and bread at dusk, horses that know my hands, work that leaves us tired and clean." "And trouble?" She smiled into his shirt. "We'll keep a little of that. It suits us, but the kind that serves love, not scorches it." They returned west by the long road, not because they had to. Wires moved faster now, and men who had doubted were busy apologizing to their own children by building better fences, but because they wanted the journey to teach their bodies what their minds already knew. Each night they let the world be enough. A flat rock warm from sun, a smell of rain in the late air, stars that looked like nails holding the sky's good boards in place. When they reached the valley where the Baxter land began again, the hills opened their palms. The new fences stood true. The house rose from the earth without swagger, lines honest, eaves generous, windows that wanted light. Men who had once worked elsewhere and lost too much had found days here that didn't ask for their dignity as payment. Women had stitched curtains and stories and the kind of jokes that make chores lighter. Children ran with the indifference to sorrow that only safe ground teaches. Clyde took the porch steps like a man whose feet had learned the pleasure of arriving. Rose paused beside the door, fingers finding the small brass plate Clyde had set with her name beside his, not beneath it. She traced the letters, a private act. When she looked at him, her eyes were bright with the kind of tears that heal as they fall. "Home," she said. "Home," he echoed. They did not try to bless the place with speeches. They blessed it by living in it. Morning coffee. Noon shade, evening laughter that came easily and knew where to sit. Rose taught a boy how to read a ledger honestly. She taught a girl how to ride a mare who wanted to run sideways just to prove she could. Clyde taught a man how to build a gate that didn't squeal and how to hold his temper when the hinge still complained. They wrote the law of their life with kindness, broke it occasionally with mischief, and amended it with kisses that started like forgiveness and ended like praise. Some nights they sat on the porch and listened to rain approach across the flats, like a kindness arriving after a hard story. Rose would rest her head in Clyde's lap and close her eyes, letting the sound move through her and rinse the old rooms she still carried. He would card his fingers through her hair and think of the nun's habit he'd first seen, and the leather that had replaced it, and the bone-deep truth that had outlasted both. Healing is slow and sure. It asks for repetition. They gave it gladly, touch after touch, meal after meal, calloused hand to calloused hand, day laid upon day, until the ache in both their chests was not a blade, but a seam that held. The territory learned, too. Not perfectly. No place becomes a saint in a season, but truly. Deputies remembered their neighbours' first names. Editors wrote with fewer adjectives and more facts. A banker's son took a job that paid less than his father had wanted and slept better for it. In Tucson, the telegraph operator married the woman who had told him it was a brave day to be honest. His hands shook only when she walked into the room now. At the mine, spring water kept its vow to flow whether anyone thanked it or not. The world had not changed so much as remembered itself, which is the deepest change of all. Months later, a letter came stamped from far away and written in a careful hand that had once been careless. The junior clerk from Kellerman's office. He had moved to a smaller town, a smaller bank, a larger life. He thanked them without names. He said he'd learned to knock the bottom of bread before he bought it. He said he'd told a boy the story of proof that doesn't burn. Rose read it aloud and placed it in the drawer where they kept gratitude, which is to say on the kitchen table where it could be touched every day. On a morning so clear it made even mistakes look fortunate, they rode the fence line together with the slow pleasure of people who do not measure the day against a whip. At a high place where the land showed off its angles, they stopped. The wind leaned friendly against their shoulders. Below, cattle moved like stubborn sentences across the grass. Above, a hawk made small circles that translated as Amen. "Do they fear us or desire us?" Clyde asked, smiling. The old desert question softened into a porch joke. "Both," Rose said, turning her face to him, light running along her cheek like water. "And that's exactly how we like it." He kissed her, and in that kiss lived all of it. Fire and water, ledger and prayer, night and porch. The first question asked under stars, and the last answer given under sun. The world didn't pause because it didn't need to. It had learned to hold happiness alongside duty, passion alongside peace. If this story laid a warm hand on your heart, if you felt something healing move inside you as love learned to be brave, we'd be grateful if you gently press like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale. Your presence keeps the fire bright and the porch light on for every traveler who needs a place to rest.